Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to start the series on the Queen's Gambit Accepted. It's going to be the new opening in the d4 series, and this is going to be a simple and short series, only 4 videos long. This is going to be an introductory video where I'm going to try to explain the idea behind the opening, and then in 3 separate videos we are going to be looking at 3 main variations of the opening, the main line and the 2 main alternatives. So the Queen's Gambit Accepted is a very underrated opening, which is what makes it extremely interesting for me, and I think it should be interesting for most d5 players who respond classically to d4, because it's very unexplored on anything below, I would say, FIDE master or international master level, and it's not really taken seriously. Most people don't expect it. Most people just play against it without knowing the theory. And most people actually hope they will not face it. And still, most players who respond to d4 with d5 will either play the Queen's Gambit Declined, or they will play the Slav or the Semi-Slav or whatever. But the Queen's Gambit Accepted is a very interesting opening. So let's get into the opening. So after d4, d5, white plays the Queen's Gambit. Black now doesn't play c6 or e6, he takes. Now, firstly, what's the idea behind the Queen's Gambit? Well, the Queen's Gambit is a pawn sacrifice, which isn't a real pawn sacrifice, because most often black doesn't take the pawn. Then the second most common scenario is that black takes the pawn and white regains it easily. And thirdly, there's the option of black taking the pawn and white getting huge compensation for that, which happens in most cases. So the compensation happens in most cases. So white is actually hoping for d takes c4 in theory of the Queen's Gambit. At least that's the way it used to be in the 19th century or whenever, 18th century. Why? Because then white can expand with e4, and white has this tremendous central control for a cost of a pawn, which can hardly be defended. In fact, it's attacked immediately. Defending it is kind of awkward. So that's what I think it used to be about. And then on my level and anything below serious, like professional chess player, I think most people don't know how to prove compensation when black takes. So d takes c4, the Queen's Gambit Accepted. White has a couple of options at his disposal. The 2 variations which I'm going to mention first are sidelines, and they will branch out of the main line more often, although white has the option to play them straight away. One of them is Queen a4 check, which is, excuse me, I just saw that on the screen. I wrote Queen a5 check. That's a typo, so it's Queen a4. So after Queen a4 check, this is the Mannheim variation, or the accelerated Mannheim variation, which we are going to be seeing in the main lines after knight f3, so I'm not going to talk about it here. And the second sideline is the so-called Showalter variation, which starts usually after knight f3 and then knight c3, but it's going to transpose. So if white plays one of these 2 moves on move 3 and you know the main line, then you're not going to be in trouble. The 3 separate variations I'm going to be covering in 3 videos are knight f3, which is the main line, e3, which is the main sideline, and then e4, which is basically the only alternative to calm positions, which I'm going to try to show you in a moment. So knight f3 is the main line, and from here on black basically has to play knight f6. That's the best move. Now again, there are a couple of options for white. He could play Queen a4 going into the Mannheim, he could play knight c3 going into the Showalter, or he could play the main move, which is e3. You're going to be seeing all 3 probably, but e3 is by far the most popular. When I cover knight f3, the main line, in detail, I'm going to be talking about all 3. Black plays the move e6, white recaptures his pawn, fine. And now here's the point. You've given white the center. You've distracted him for a moment, he had to recapture that pawn. Not that bishop c4 is not a good move anyway, but now your goal in these positions with either knight f3 or e3 on move 3 for white, which are main line-ish, is to play c5 and break open that center. Now here's the advantage in this opening for black. Well, here's the advantage of playing this opening for black. Very often white is going to have an IQP position, which the isolated queen's pawn is going to be easy to dissolve if white knows what he is doing. So he will often get to play the move d5 and get rid of his isolated pawn. But the good news is that, for example, white castles, that's just the main move. Now here, black's best objectively, according to the engines and theory, is to play a6. Then knight c6 is also a move, queen c7 is a move, but black could immediately go for c takes d4. And now, of course, e takes d4 isn't really a viable option. That's, knight takes d4 isn't really a viable option, because that gets the knight out of the center and out of the king side, and then white loses central control and loses central pawns. And basically, the position would be equal or slightly better for black. So e takes d gets us to the key structure of the Queen's Gambit accepted, which could be played with, let's say, knight c3, a6, knight c6, and rook e1 inserted, or different variations. But usually these are going to be the important pieces, and then knight c3, knight c6. So in this position, white has an isolated queen's pawn, black has a semi-blockade over the isolated d pawn, and it's very hard to keep that blockade going. Now, in isolated queen's pawn positions, usually the side with the isolated pawn wants to attack, so white will want to play knight e5, rook e1, maybe queen b3, maybe bishop b3 and queen somewhere else, get the other knight into play, and basically bishop g5 or bishop h6 and just try to checkmate. On the other hand, black wants to do something calmer, like knight d5 to blockade the pawn, bishop e7 castles, knight c6, knight a5 maybe even knight c6, knight e7, knight d5 to blockade if he is given time. In these positions, there isn't really time to do that, because after bishop e7, black has to castle, and knight c3, basically whatever black does, white will have the move d5. And these positions often end in a symmetrical pawn structure once these two pawns get traded off, and both sides are left with 5 pawns in a symmetrical pawn structure. One side, usually white, is going to be a tempo up by having his rook on e1 or something else played, and white should be slightly better, but very symmetrical. So that's knight f3. The same can be said about e3 positions, which, of course, there are differences. I'm going to cover the theory of both in separate videos, but e3 leads to similar issues. So knight f6, bishop takes c4. Of course, e3 just doesn't waste the tempo on knight f3. Recaptures the pawn straight away. And now if e6, knight f3, c5, we have transposed. So that was the same thing. Okay. But instead of that, after e3, black has alternatives, and black doesn't have to go for the same variation. Black has interesting options based on the fact that white didn't play knight f3. Black can play e5. And that's, I think, the most interesting line. I'm going to be focusing on that in the video, because after bishop c4, ed4, ed4, white is again forced into an isolated queen's pawn structure, and after knight f6, knight f3, you now have the option to play the move bishop d6. You don't have to play bishop e7. Castles, because white hasn't castled yet. And now it's not that easy to dissolve this pawn. There's basically nothing to attack in this position. There's no pawn on e6. And this, I think, is very interesting. So I would say that e3 is slightly inferior to knight f3 for white. So this, I think, is the key position. There are other options for black and for white. As I said, we're going to be covering that in the video on pawn to e3. Now, e4 is probably the most straightforward way to play this position, and the way it was meant to be played. You're playing for compensation and you don't care about the pawn. Of course, if black isn't careful, you will get both the central control and the pawn back, in which case white should already be better. So what can black do about that? There are a couple of options. There are 4 moves which I'm going to be focusing on in the video on e4. And all 4 are quite different. There are 2 main moves, e5 and knight f6. e5 is slightly less provocative than knight f6. Knight f6 leads to positions with, of course, e5, knight d5, and now bishop takes, c4, knight b6. Sort of Alekhine positions in which this knight has gone from f6 to b6 and the pawns have advanced. So I think for Alekhine players this is going to be natural. After something like knight b3, knight c6, I always like the white side of this, so if I'm black I would never in the world play knight f6, but we are going to be covering that. e5 challenges the center straight away, and of course taking doesn't make much sense. You can trade the queens off and just get a good position, so white plays the move knight f3, black takes on d4, bishop takes on c4, knight c6 defending the pawn. You could play c5, but that's considered slightly better for white after knight e5. There's pressure here, so already some issues, bishop e6 and stuff like that. So knight c6 to avoid knight e5, castles bishop e6, and the position continues from here. So e5, again, not ideal, but better than knight f6 in my opinion. And then what I think is the most interesting move is just c5. Just saying, okay, I know what I'm doing, and I know the Queen's Gambit accepted, and e4 is not going to help you, and this is very straightforward. Against c5, again, taking is not really a viable option, so d5, knight f6 attacking the center immediately, knight c3 defending, and now b5. And this is what I like about the opening. So now you have a 4-2 pawn majority on the queen side. If white isn't careful, this could be easily winning. Of course, knight takes b5, queen a5, knight c3, knight takes e4 would be good for black. So after b5 you cannot really take. So c5 against e4 is what I really like for black. Again, after e4 there's another move, there's knight c6, which after d5, knight e5, queen d4, knight d3 check, bishop d3 is complicated, and after knight f3, bishop g4, d5, knight e5 should be okay for black, although I'm not a big fan. So here's my summary of this introductory video. The Queen's Gambit accepted is, I think, a great option for black to have in his repertoire. Against e4 you have this very aggressive option to play the move c5, which will confuse players with white if they don't know what they're doing. And against e3 and knight f3 setups, you can either play an isolated queen's pawn position, which he's going to be dissolving the pawn, and then the position is going to be equal, or you can force an isolated queen's pawn position in which you are better. So I honestly don't see a downside to playing this opening. I hope this helps you. I'm going to be covering the 3 variations in the next 3 days, so hopefully you get something from this. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.